The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, pollster Vic Fingerhut on how progressive populism can win elections, plus Bill Press with a timeline of events leading up to January 6th and how they implicate Trump in the effort to overturn an election. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Vic Fingerhut has established an unmatched record of moving millions of votes to the progressive side of the political spectrum. Recently, he lent his expertise to Canada's New Democratic Party as they face a pivotal election. And we say hello to Vic Fingerhut, veteran polling and media advisor who's been a consultant to over 7 Democratic presidential campaigns, stretching back to Hubert Humphrey and Jimmy Carter. He's also one of the few pollsters who, throughout 2016, saw the serious political danger to the Democrats of a populist like Trump, who, of course, had appealed to traditional Democratic working-class voters. Vic Fingerhut, as always, great to have you with us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks very much, Jim. Always great to be with you.
And, you recently wrote an advisory note to Canada's New Democratic Party, or NDP, as they head into a critical election on September 20th. As we get started here, remind us of what the NDP stands for and what's at stake in this election.
Well, NDP stands for the New Democratic Party. It was born about 50, 60 years ago. It was basically a party from the Western provinces of the labor movement. And it clearly was the most progressive party in the country. One of its founders, a guy named Tommy Douglas, was from Saskatchewan, which had the first healthcare system operating in Canada, which became the model of Canada Health. So it's a party with a long and distinguished progressive tradition. And I was first asked to come up there in the 1980s. I'd done some stuff for the Canadian labor movement. They asked me to help the party. And I worked for a wonderful leader named Ed Broadbent, who's very well known in Canada. And so they've been operating for a long period of time. They've been the third party primarily because of history. The two parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals of Trudeau, who you're more familiar with, they both get around 35-40% of the vote. When I went up there, the NDP was below 10, but in a few years we got it up to 30 or 40% in the polls, when they ran a real populist campaign. In fact, it was modeled on Harry Truman and Hubert Humphrey, which I've been involved with. And subsequently, we run a similar campaign in Australia for the Australian Labor Party that allowed them to defeat a 4-term right-wing government in Australia running on populist issues, working people, fairness on the job, healthcare. And it always amazes me that this is always a revelation to progressive parties. I mean, it's been working for them for about half a century. And when they use the stuff, they win. When they go off on some crazy thing like we're going to balance the budget, Walter Mondale's great effort, as much as he was a good guy, but I mean, this is nutty. Most people don't believe the Democrats could balance their own checkbook, no less the budget. And So the problem was, John Kerry got involved in running on foreign policy. And while the NDP has never departed that far, although they had a campaign a few years ago where they lost a huge number of seats because the leader ran on balancing the budget. People do not believe right, left of center parties when they talk about balancing the budget. I think the only one who believed Mondale was Mrs. Mondale, and even she had some doubts about his program. So when they stick to working people and who's going to protect you on the job and who's going to make sure mom and grandma are treated well in their retirement, when they look for a tax system that's fair for working people and not tilted in favor of the rich, the left and center parties do very well. Now, in fairness to the NDP, they have some competition with the Liberals of Trudeau. It's a party that, because of history, they existed for 100 years before the NDP. And they, like the Democrats and Republicans, we have histories. We have people who are fifth generation Democrats, fifth generation Republicans, although those things are breaking down in the last decade or two with the recent switch. The Republicans increasingly become the party of working class, which reflects a disaster on the part of the Democrats. That's a whole other discussion.
Right.
We abandoned the base of our party, and now we're playing catch up, which is not easy. Once burnt, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, so that's the situation in the NDP. They've been averaging, when I got there, they were averaging 10, 12 points percentage in votes. Because of a great run by a fellow named Ed Broadbent, they built up their base vote to between 18 and 22. The problem is that's where they've been sitting for the last 40 years.
Well, now going into this election, what do you consider the strengths of Canada's NDP?
The very same things. You could take a poll today and compare it to what we found 50 years ago in the 1980s. It's the same thing. What do you like about the NDP? One of the things, at the time, the NDP was at 6% of the polls. The reason they called in an American was because it looked like they were going to get wiped out. And I had connections. I'd helped the party in British Columbia fight a right-wing anti-worker government and so on. Well, they didn't have much money for polling. They were a down and out party. People were saying, well, they're a vestige of the Depression. They're over. The pollster had quit. He said he had agreed with this analysis. The NDP is history, he wrote. Anyway, we did a poll and they had very few dollars to work with, but there were just a couple questions and a few way out ridings that we thought we might have a chance at. And I asked two questions. Would you like to see the end of the NDP? And for people who said yes, I said, why? And this is at a time they're at 6% of the polls. And we asked in ridings where they were maybe getting 15 or 20%. That was their best, those were their best districts or ridings. And people said, oh, no, don't get rid of the NDP. We were getting 60% saying, no, we don't want to get rid of the NDP. And so the interviewers were instructed that after the people who said, no, they don't want to get rid of them, you ask them why. And you know what they said? They're the only party in Canada that cares about the ordinary Canadian. When I got those numbers back, I say this party is in history. This is a party with tremendous underlying, inherent, enduring strength. And so Ed Broadbent ran a campaign. We started out at 6%. 2.5 years later, we were at 45%. 700% growth. Unbelievable. Along the way, we were asked, well, Vic, can you work out a strategy for the 84 election where we win at least 12 seats? Because if you don't win 12 seats, you lose your official party status. So that means you don't get anyway, we won 30 seats 6 months after the campaign began. We went up to, and by 86, which was 2.5 years, we were up in the 40s. And then I don't want to go into this. It's probably, this is all too esoteric as it is, but some other folks took over the party structure and they abandoned the ordinary Canadian theme that had been so effective for us. And they added a theme of open and honest government. Well, nothing wrong with that. That's not a terrible thing, except that no one believed it. And the other thing is, open and honest government is a great way to get hung up on your own petard. Because if one person does something wrong, the media is going to kill you. Oh, honest, huh? What about this guy? Crazy thing. Well, anyway, even though they knocked the vote down for the next election in 1988, we still got 43 seats, the most the NDP had ever gotten, even with a watered down ordinary Canadian theme. So all I was saying in that memo that was circulated, I've worked with the Canadian labor movement and various state or provincial parts of the NDP for 40 years. I said a memo said, this is what's always worked for you. Don't go in some other direction. People don't believe you. 2 days ago, they put out their costing of their budget. This is always the doom of left-wing parties, because as soon as you start talking about the budget, the NDP, they're going to tax us to death. I mean, it's like Mondale running on the budget. I mean, it's nutty, and it's not that it's bad or evil, but it's just crazy. Anyway, so today their numbers are 21%. They're talking, well, we're gonna get 35 seats this year. Well, we got 43 seats 40 years ago.
Well, considering what they could be doing better, what's the message Canadian voters need to hear from the NDP?
Okay, well, there are various others. We're the party of ordinary Canadians. Period. We're the one who's going to fund. We got your health care. We're not owned by the big corporations, which in part the Liberals are. The Liberals are a big spending party too. So we can't outspend them. So the NDP has a little harder problem because they have another kind of left party, but it's not that left. It's really corporate left. Anyway, and people recognize that. But when we get onto liberal turf, we're going to build this, we're going to build that. People say, you guys can't. But if you get it, you say, we're going to fight for you. We're going to make sure you get treated decently at the workplace. And we're going to do all the things that work for Democrats. They work for New Democrats, and they work for the Australian Labor Party. People believe, no one believes the Australian Labor Party is going to balance the budget. Well, no one believes the Democrats going to balance the budget. It's going to take them 100 years to do that. And no one believes the NDP can balance the budget. We had a guy who ran a couple of years ago, a guy named Mulcair. He said he's going to balance the budget. And people just, they just went blank. If the same guy had simply said, we're going to fight for your family. We're going to make sure your spouse, your kids, you're treated decently at the workplace. We're going to make sure no one screws around with the Canadian healthcare system. We're going to do all those things. People believe that. That's what they liked about the NDP. In short, like the Democrats, they continually run away from their strengths. I was at the same, it's fun just to give you a little historical, the same election, 84, where Ed Broadbent beautifully took what we found about ordinary Canadians and made that theme sing. He was a brilliant speaker, blah, blah, blah. We had a great team. The same year, I was asked to be on an advisory committee for Mondale. And the difference between the small NDP fighting for the little guy, campaign basically, going back to Washington, and I love, these were all Democrats, Bob Strauss, big corporate lawyer, who had been a former DNC chairman, Mrs. Harriman, great people, Clifford Case. But the difference between going to a Democratic meeting at that time, these were all well-connected, 7-figure Washington attorneys, representing some of the biggest law firms in Washington. They're good people. They're Democrats. They're for the right things. The NDP committees were from the labor movement. They had been hands-on operatives for the NDP. They were the people who were really frontline political people. They weren't big shots from Washington who were there because they contributed a lot of money to the Democratic Party, for which I'm very grateful, which the Democrats should be very grateful. They're good people. But they had no sense of the ordinary American, the way the Canadians, when the NDP heard ordinary Canadian, it rang a bell. Yeah, that's who we're for. Canadian working people, that's who we're for. All I did was capsulize it, find it. And it wasn't me, it was Canadian people. I asked them, why not get rid of the NDP? They said, oh, they're for ordinary Canadians. We can't get rid of them. We need them. So if you ask the Democrats, I'm not sure now, but 10 years ago, if you ask, how do I get rid of the Democratic Party? If you ask Republicans, and I know this from my polling, this is true, they would say, no, we don't want to get rid of the Democrats. We want to hold their spending down a little bit. We don't want some of the stuff they do. But God, you get rid of them, there's going to be no health care, there's going to be no Medicare. Who's going to protect my kid at the workplace? It's the same set of arguments and discussion. I think Biden personally has come to recognize this. And he's been the most worker-friendly, really the most worker-friendly president, I think, since FDR.
Now, that's certainly saying something. We're talking with progressive pollster Vic Fingerhut. Coming up next, what Democrats in the U.S. need to do to rebuild their connection with working people. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
We've got the Academy Awards, the Emmys, and Grammys. But what should we call the award for the most extraordinary performance by a corporate profiteer? How about the sleazy, with winners getting a solid gold sculpture of a middle finger? There were so many worthy contenders, but one corporation exhibited uncommon callousness, so the 2021 sleazy goes to Tyson Foods. The meatpacking giant has regularly run roughshod over workers, farmers, communities, and the environment, not to mention the millions of animals it fattens and slaughters. But the coronavirus pulled out the worst in Tyson's corporate ethic. Last April, its billionaire chair, John Tyson, ranted that health officials who were closing down several of his slaughterhouses that had become hotbeds of contagion were creating another crisis, a national meat shortage. Responding instantly, our corporate compassionate, burger-gobbling president decreed that meatpacking plants were crucial to America's national security and must be kept open at all cost. Trump's edict required workers to return to their jobs or be fired. Only there was no meat shortage. Indeed, Tyson and other giants actually increased their meat exports to China last year. Meanwhile, COVID rampaged through Tyson's factories. In its Waterloo, Iowa facility alone, a third of the processing workers were infected and at least 6 died. Which brings us to the corporate play that cinched this year's sleazy for Tyson. Waterloo slaughterhouse supervisors actually knew that the back-to-work order would sicken hundreds, but not exactly how many. So, managers organized a winner-take-all betting pool on the percent of employees who would test positive. It was simply something fun, said one, kind of a morale boost. This is Jim Hightower saying the virus infected more than a third of the workers in the plant. Some fun, huh? The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by our new Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe. With kick-ass political spark plugs like Beto O'Rourke, musical champions like Marcia Ball, and grassroots change makers like the New Georgia Project and People's Action, the Lowdown Happy Hour is reaching out to you to help put the move in movement. So grab a libation and join the fun. Details at hightowerlowdown.org.
We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We're speaking to Vic Fingerhut, veteran polling and media advisor. He's been a consultant to over 7 Democratic presidential campaigns and several political campaigns around the world. Vic, we've been talking about your recent work with Canada's new Democratic Party and why you believe they need to remind voters they are the party that will stand up for working families. So the question is, what kind of parallel patterns do you see here in the United States, and how well are Democrats doing in the way they're reaching out to working Americans?
Well, I'll tell you, I was asked before the 2020 election, the AFL-CIO asked me to come over and help them with their polling and messaging. And I think the Democrats did fine. The problem is, and I think Biden, if you looked at specifically what he's done in terms of getting rid of anti-labor people in the Labor Department, I mean, it's amazing. He's done a lot of very good stuff. There are a couple, but they're not making any inroads. The Trump people are still planning to vote Trump, and not just Trump, people who just working people who should be ours, whose mommy and daddy were Democrats. We used to get 60% of that vote. We're getting 35% of it now, 40%. It's a disaster. And, part of it was what we've done over 15 and 20 years. You can't expect Biden to turn everything around in 20 minutes. We passed NAFTA. We deindustrialized part of the Midwest and looked to people, well, this is the Democrats, but they don't seem to care about us anymore. They used to be our party. They used to represent working people. And even at the beginning of the 2016 election, Clinton, and she was a good senator, did good stuff, was for good things. She wanted to extend it to this TPP, this Trans-Pacific thing. But she wanted to give people more of what devastated them already. And again, it reflects she wasn't in touch with ordinary Democrats in Ohio, Minnesota. Well, not Minnesota so much, but Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, the states we lost in 2016. There's no reason we should have lost those states. There were more Democrats than Republicans in those states. But, people, I interviewed iron workers in focus groups. And they said, I've been a lifelong Democrat, but so many of my people were out of work. I was out of work. I was working 20 hours a week. And I said, under Obama, as much as I love Obama. And I said, well, I can't do any worse under this guy, Trump. He seems like kind of a jerk. But, they didn't love the guy. They just said, well, if he can put me back to work, I'll vote for the guy. And for people who are comfortably in the suburbs or the Upper West Side of New York, that's not an issue. They're already comfortable. You take someone who's been scrapping since the first decade of the century because of deindustrialization, whether it be southern West Virginia or Pennsylvania or Michigan, give this guy a chance. And the reality is, he was a different Republican. He was a populist Republican, which is dangerous to the Democrats. He talked about working people And I'll tell you, on certain things, he did stuff. He stood up on the trade issue. He said, we're not going to get pushed around anymore. I've heard lifelong Democrats at union focus groups saying he's the first guy who stood up for us. So you can't blame the fact that we haven't turned this all around in less than a couple of years with Biden. He's doing what he should be doing. His policies, I think, are excellent. But this is more than policy. This is image. This is a feeling that the party didn't care anymore. Didn't care. So they go over, they respond to this other populist, the right-wing populist, and it's not going to be easy getting back to them. I think if it was based on policy, they'd all be Democrats again. Biden's doing a great job. But that's not what politics is all about. It's like feelings and who's on my side. And there's also there's been the elitism of the Democrats. You go on television and it's one thing to call Trump a fool, which probably is not inaccurate. It's an oversimplification, I think. But when you call and you make fun of Trump voters, that to me is the height of stupidity. These are the people we're trying to get back, and you go on late night TV, and Trump voters are depicted as a bunch of racist idiots. Well, you can do that. We feel, oh, this is great. That's who voted against us, these racist idiots. Well, that's terrific, except you're never going to get them back if you keep doing that. And that's a hard thing to turn off. I mean, that's the prevailing discussion. I go into discussion with progressives who are very reasonable people, decent people, but as soon as you talk about the Trump voter, they treat him as some idiot. Well, and racist, and that racist. There are some who are racist. You know, the Democrats had a lot of racists voting for him for many years when they were carrying the so-called solid South. But I remember a guy at a union in Pittsburgh at a union focus group who said, "I voted Democrat all my life." I was asking, which of you guys voted Republican? And there were a couple of women, ironworkers. I says, I did. I voted for Trump. And I voted for Trump twice. The first time was because I needed, I was looking for work. And this guy said he could do something, and he did until the, COVID thing. And he said, then they started calling me a racist because I voted for Trump in 2016. He said, well, I'm not a racist. I was a Democrat. I voted for Obama twice. And they call me a racist. Well, you know what he said to me at this meeting? And it really went through me like a knife. He says, well, you know what? Screw them. I'm going to vote for Trump again. In other words, by our arrogant treatment and really ignorant, we were totally ignorant about the nature of a good part of the Trump vote. We pushed them back into Trump's camp.
Right. And
I think we need a combination of rethinking our message and rethinking how we treat it. Because I'll tell you, every time a 2016 Trump voter votes Republican again and again, the line with the Democratic Party gets thinner and thinner. The link becomes thinner and thinner. And, I think we have to recognize that, or we're going to see these numbers every week, 50, 30. Yep.
Before we let you go, we've got a little over a year left before the 2022 midterms.
Yeah.
What do you consider the biggest challenges for progressive Democrats?
Well, I think these are the challenges. I mean, I think on one hand, we've lost independence because of what happened in Afghanistan, but I think they're coming back. I mean, they go somewhere every week. So, the biggest challenge is turning this thing around, getting working class Democrats and lower middle income Democrats who are who are working people. They may be making $100,000 a year, but they're still working people, and they still see themselves as working people. Is to develop a program to get back to them. I think we would, try to think, emphasize, for example, work side issues. People believe the Democrats still, even Republicans, believe they're going to protect the kid at the workplace. You don't hear that being used anymore. most of the Democratic media now is Trump is a jerk and he's caused all the problem. He caused the problem in Afghanistan. He caused the COVID problem. He caused all the problem. Well, it's not bad politics doing that, and there's some truth to some of it, but it's not going to get working class Democrats back. It's just going to tick them off even more. They're saying, hey, this guy stood up for America. He stopped the trade stuff. He got me back to work. And maybe, and they don't love him. I mean, I've been, at union meetings, and they say the guy's a jerk. So for Democrats running around saying the guy's a jerk, doesn't add anything to our case. The case is who's on your side. Do you believe the Republicans are going to protect your kid at the workplace? No one believes that. But we're not saying that. We're saying Trump is a jerk. No, that's all we're saying. So, we're happy. There are still more Democrats than Republicans in the country, not by much anymore. At one point, we had a 15-point lead. Now we're lucky with 2 or 3. But you take what you can get. But so that's what I would do, Jim. I just think we have to. I think we have to reframe our message. I have no problem with Biden's policies, domestic policies. I think they're excellent. And the question is, people, a lot of times people don't make the image that's presented, and the portrayal of people is so important. If you're called a jerk, if the other party's calling you a jerk, so you gave him a couple $1,000 more, they ain't still going to vote for you. You're going to buy his love or vote for a few thousand extra bucks, or even 5,000 extra bucks. If you're calling me a jerk and a racist, forget it. I'm never going to vote for you guys. Yeah. So I think that's the issue.
Okay. Vic Fingerhut, veteran polling and media advisor, been a consultant to over 7 Democratic presidential campaigns. And of course, you hear Vic here on 21st Century Democrats, the America's Democrats podcast from time to time. Vic, as always, we appreciate your time with us today. Can't wait to do it again soon.
Okay, good seeing you again. Always interesting.
Thank you, Vic. Take care. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with the first of his 3-part series, Our Democracy in Peril.
Is there any doubt that January 6th was sort of the ultimate act and an attempt to overthrow the United States government, and that Donald Trump himself was behind it?
So I don't think there's a way to avoid that conclusion based on all the facts that we know, that this came so very close to interrupting the peaceful transfer of power. And in a certain sense, it was an interruption of the peaceful transfer of power because there was a violent attempt by some to do just that. And it certainly seems that Donald Trump, at a minimum, in the moment of seeing this all take place on his television screen, did nothing to stop it when he had a huge, enormous responsibility to do just that. And then we have a lot of indications that it's essentially what he wanted to see happen, that he wanted his supporters to interrupt the business of Congress on January 6th.
Right. I want to get to some of those step by step, as you have reported again so well on Just Security, you and your colleagues, I should say. Had it been successful, would it be fair to call what happened a coup d'etat? Was this a failed coup d'etat?
So I think so. And it's just ominous to even think about it in these terms. But what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time was fearful of was a coup d'etat, a use of the military as part of this scheme to hold on to power on the part of Donald Trump and his close associates. That was their intent, and the U.S. military was poised, it seems, from all reports, for that very scenario.
Right. So backing up, it's pretty clear, isn't it, that this did not start on January 6th. There are lots of events leading up to January 6th.
That's right. I think there are a number of different events leading up to January 6th, including the ways in which Donald Trump primed his supporters and his most violent supporters, and also the way in which Donald Trump and his very close associates like White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows were trying other routes to illegally or illegitimately interfere with the Justice Department to try to get them to overturn the election.
So clear that things started ahead of time, maybe even, I think, as one of your articles pointed out, a year ahead of time, and Donald Trump was involved, and Donald Trump did not act alone, right?
That's right. He did not act alone. And a year ahead of time is when he is beginning to broadcast to his supporters that political violence is acceptable, that he will not necessarily go along with a peaceful transfer of power, that the election is going to be rigged against them. You know, it's all building. So it's not just that something occurred on the morning of January 6th.
Right.
Really starts long before then.
Were there any crimes committed?
So I think that the strongest evidence of crimes that we already have in the public record is Donald Trump and Mark Meadows pressuring the Justice Department to create investigations and make announcements of election fraud that are based on no reasonable predicate. And that level of coercion does actually trigger federal felonies in the respect of there's a provision 18 U.S.C. 610, which is the political coercion crime that nobody should pressure, try to intimidate an official to engage in any political activity on behalf of a candidate. And just to make it so crystally clear, I think one of the smoking gun pieces of evidence is a January 3rd letter by a senior Justice Department official, the Associate Deputy Attorney General, who is expecting Trump to fire the acting Attorney General that day. And he writes the letter for mass resignations. And it says, quote, Acting Attorney General Jeff Rosen, over the course of the last week, repeatedly refused the president's direct instructions to utilize the Department of Justice's law enforcement powers for improper ends, end quote. And that is at the heart of 18 U.S.C. 610. So I think that's, to me, right up there at the top of the list. And then the second is it stands to be shown how far the Select Committee, for example, will be able to get into this, but was Donald Trump inciting his supporters to engage in the very crimes for which most of them have been indicted? And that's the crimes of trespassing into the Capitol and trying to interrupt the business of Congress. We don't need to get into whether or not he also envisioned them engaging in significant acts of violence. That alone, I think, would be enough.
So on August 8 on your site, Just Security, you outlined, you've mentioned a couple of times Mark Meadows, and I was struck by that timeline you give because I didn't realize the extent to which basically this was Mark Meadows' full-time job now, right? Trying to undermine and then overturn the election. It looks like he didn't have time for anything else.
Yes.
And you mentioned 9 different acts of his. I'd like to go through them. The first one, Mark Meadows and Rudy Giuliani created a parallel track to raise election fraud claims. So is that you're saying inside and outside the White House, they were coordinating this?
That's right. So the words parallel track come directly from Wall Street Journal reporter Michael Bender's book, and he reported on this. So he basically says that the White House Chief of Staff, acting with the president's personal lawyer, create a parallel track to try to raise these election fraud claims, get them investigated, bring on board very fringe people who are also going to try to overturn, for example, they target in significant part Georgia's elections.
Right.
And that's the parallel track. And it's, it even has the echo of the Ukraine scandal with Giuliani setting up a parallel track parallel to the State Department. Here's a parallel political track to the normal ways in which the U.S. government handles any kinds of questions of election fraud.
And then point number 2 is that the Trump campaign followed up under pressure from Mark Meadows, you say, followed up on Meadows' theory that tens of thousands of illegal aliens voted in Arizona.
That's right. And the words Meadows theory come from, Carol Leonnig and Philip Rucker's book. So they report on this part of it, which is that it's Meadows' theory that there are these quote unquote illegal aliens who voted in Arizona. Based on nothing in the end of the day. I mean, just based on, I don't know what, like, was it rumor or what? Because in the end, even the campaign says there's nothing there. But it's remarkable that's the chief of staff coordinating that with his theory so that the campaign follows up on it, not the apparatus of U.S. government, but rather the campaign. Yeah. So it shows that connection once again.
And then now here comes this character, Jeffrey Clark, who has been getting a good deal of attention lately, post January 6th, that it was Mark Meadows that introduced President Trump to Jeffrey Clark, and they began plotting on how to oust Jeffrey Rosen and to get the DOJ involved in trying to overturn the election results in Georgia.
That's right. So Jeffrey Clark is one of the worst actors, it seems like, in this whole scenario. He is plotting to get the acting attorney general fired so he can be the acting attorney general. He's coming up with totally off-range theories, like there's an Italian military satellite that altered ballots, or that China used a thermostat to alter ballots. So I actually think he might be, to be honest, a true believer.
Sounds like it, right?
But that he's involved, and who is the one introducing this figure to the president of the United States, but the chief of staff, who's supposed to act as a gatekeeper to avoid any such kind of individual interacting with the president. Yet it seems like Clark and Trump end up coordinating, collaborating in their scheme, conspiring, I think is probably the better term. And all of this is happening behind the scenes. The Justice Department senior officials don't even know it. So all of this is Meadows violating well-settled White House contact policy, Justice Department contact policy that says there shouldn't even be these contacts. And even if there ever were such a contact, it must be with the acting attorney general, deputy attorney general, with their knowledge or direct involvement.
Yeah. Now, before Rosen takes over, Bill Barr kind of threw a wrench into things because he came out and actually said that he had seen no evidence of election fraud that would have affected the outcome in the election. As you point out in your fourth point, didn't make Mark Meadows or Donald Trump very happy.
That's right. So Barr deliberately decides to do this on December 1st. So he reaches out to the Associated Press and gives this statement, which is a bit of a bombshell, especially coming from him at the time. And then so happens to have a meeting at the White House that same day. And Meadows expresses his great frustration / anger for the Attorney General having done this. And then they also meet with Trump, and the Attorney General goes point by point through all of the bogus allegations, explaining why they are all, in his words, BS, according to multiple reports, including Jonathan Karl. So it's remarkable that, Meadows is on that side of the equation because apparently the White House counsel is also present in that meeting and speaks on behalf of Barr. But it seems like it's Meadows and Trump together very angry at the Attorney General for speaking the truth.
And then I didn't realize this. You point out next that Mark Meadows, again, we're talking about the White House Chief of Staff himself, goes down to Georgia and meets with the lead investigator working for the Secretary of State, again, putting pressure on her to come up with some evidence of fraud.
That's right.
Totally outside his role as White House Chief of Staff.
Yes, I assume that the select committee will find out who paid for his flight.
Good point.
By way of example. Yeah.
And whether he took an official government jet, right?
Exactly, right? Which will add even more evidence to his criminal liability. So yes, I myself had missed that until I did this deep research. It's just remarkable. And when then Trump calls her the next day, he says that he's calling her because of Meadows telling him to or suggesting that he do. And that's when he asks her to, quote unquote, discover the fraud in her role as an investigator, and that Mark Meadows tells him that she's a good person. So Meadows is directly implicated in all of that too.
And then it was the next day that Trump calls the famous call to Raffensperger, right, where he says, just find me 11,782 votes. That's all I want, right? Again, yes. Mark Meadows sets that call up.
Yes, he does. He sets up the call, and when the call's transcript and audio recording breaks the next day, apparently multiple allies of President Trump are very angry at Meadows for having set up the call. And according to reports, they tried 18 times to reach Raffensperger before they finally do.
Whoa.
And then Meadows also sits in on the call and participates on the side of Trump, pushing them to, quote unquote, find the votes. And also Meadows does something else remarkable on the call himself. He asks the Georgia officials to share internal voting data. And the Georgia government lawyer basically says that's illegal. He says we're not legally permitted. That's protected by law. And Meadows repeats his ask for them to share that information.
And we've talked before about Meadows continuing to pressure Justice Department officials, but then moving over to the Department of Defense, as you report, the then acting Secretary of Defense Chief of Staff, Kash Patel, says on January 6th, he spoke to Meadows nonstop. What was going on? Was this Meadows saying, don't send the National Guard?
So this one is hard to know. I do think that Meadows played a very nefarious role up until January 6th. And I think he's got significant criminal exposure for his actions. It's a little bit more difficult to know what is happening on January 6th itself if he thinks that they've gone too far. The fact that he's in constant communication with Kash Patel is not good news for Meadows. Kash Patel is not the kind of actor or player that one thinks was on the good side of things that led to and included the insurrection. And in fact, according to a lot of the reporting, the Rucker and Lennick book and others, General Milley, for example, is very concerned about the installment of Kash Patel, a kind of Devin Nunes. He worked for Devin Nunes, Trump loyalist. So the fact that Kash Patel says he's in nonstop communication with Meadows is not something I think Meadows would like the public to know.
And finally, you make the point, and we expected this, it didn't happen, and we wonder why it didn't happen, that Trump was considering issuing a preemptive pardon for himself, for Rudy Giuliani, and for Mark Meadows.
Yeah, so that was reported by Bloomberg, and there were different reports of different lists that Trump had, but Bloomberg had the list that had Meadows' name on it. And I didn't remark on it or think about it at the time, but now having gone back and seen all of the ways in which Meadows was deeply involved, I think it's astonishing. Like, why is Mark Meadows on the list of people who need a preemptive pardon and in their framework? What kind of criminal liability or exposure do they think he has?
Bill Press with Ryan Goodman, founding co-editor-in-chief of Just Security. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible, Vic Fingerhut and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.